welcome to Theology Sabbath School on a very unusual March 14th. I'm Carl Cosart, and for the first time we're really broadcasting remotely. We've talked about in the School of Theology of doing something like this, but we talked about all the technical challenges and difficulties, and here we are, just really pulling this together this morning, actually deciding that this was important enough for our community for us to get together and have time as a Sabbath School class. It has certainly been a very unusual week for us. We would never have thought a month ago that our Sabbath School class would not be meeting. It's kind of made me think about those around the world who aren't able to meet together because of persecution and other challenges. But we still have the privilege of coming together now in a virtual community. So I thought we might just begin today to talk about what's happened this week, transition into some prayer time, and then talk about today's Sabbath School lesson. So what a week it's been. Your thoughts, reactions to what's happened here with the pandemic now that's shut down Walla Walla University and also shut down our church today.
Just kind of, I think along with many people, I hear about disease far away from me, and I've heard these sorts of things before, right? There's something cropping up here, something cropping up there, and the thought that our little community, at least initially for me, it's like, well, I hope things kind of settle down, and I didn't think of its direct personal impact, and then just kind of, as the days pass, you begin to think, well, maybe, and then sure enough this week, the reality of
we're not so isolated here.
Yeah, yeah, so.
It is fascinating to see the news coming in hour by hour and something new happens. And that creates this anxiety also in our classrooms. It was pretty visible. Yes.
Yeah, all the students on our campus had to pack up and head home all that could, and so certainly stressful for them as well. The Campbellsville here will be closed for person-to-person classes for 4 weeks. So we have 2 weeks now for finals and break, and then the first 4 weeks of this quarter. So just unprecedented events. So.
Yeah, and Matilda said it, but I asked classes, was it Thursday or Friday? I just said, well, how's everyone doing? And students had the stress of the usual end of quarter stress, so they're worried about grades and all that. And then on top of that, now finals are somehow different. They're going to not be in person, and then they're trying to figure out where they're going to go and live. And then, like one student said, I think this is true. He said, well, for us, like for me, he said, I'm not really personally afraid because you look at the statistics, my age group is not really in grave danger. He said, so I'm not really worried about me, but he said, I am worried about my parents, and I'm worried about my grandparents. And I think that's where most students, hearts were and are now. So
I guess actually for me, I can say I'm actually quite relieved because this morning I was supposed to be on a plane to Greece, and that finally canceled yesterday with countries closing down and all those restrictions. So I'm kind of relieved. I still feel like this is a bit of a bubble. It's not quite got to us, at least like it has in Seattle with live people dying, but we know it's on its way, and we don't know what the future holds, but we know that we're in God's hands, and that can give us peace no matter what our circumstances are. So, things we need to pray for in our community.
So we actually talked about this off camera beforehand and spent some time mentioning specific names, situations that we know of from previous Sabbath School classes, requests that have been shared, and you guys can chime in if you want, but kind of our thought was, without people specifically asking for situations today, we didn't want to record names and specific details of the prayer requests, but I guess we would want all of you to know that we did talk about specific things, and we know about funerals, we know about falls, we know about surgeries that we've talked about before, and we'll pray about those now in a general kind of way.
And maybe also we can mention, I had a student come by, and I think he's typical of many students on our campus. He said, home is not really an option for me.
Yes, there are
Because
many in that
home
situation.
is not stable, home is not good, it'll be detrimental for me. And so they're kind of stuck. One student saying, how do I pay for my apartment with now no income here? So there are students who are really at a loss of what to do, and
Yes.
need to pray for them, really need to pray for them, so.
Yeah, the student employment, I think, is an issue for, in terms of student concerns, like school continues, but we won't be able to be here, we won't be able to work to pay for the schooling that we had anticipated. So it's, the ripple effects are.
And even people not having to apply for permission to stay on campus, like renting non-campus owned properties, their rent still comes from student employment jobs,
Right.
Yeah.
So I talk to students who will have to move out of their house that they're renting unless they find something else. So the logistics are, I think, beyond what we immediately think of when we think of the implications.
Everything's, I was looking too, that, alumni weekend is canceled. When has that ever happened before?
Yep.
So it just goes on and on and on, and we just pray that it'll be as short as possible, this disruption. But we don't know. We really don't know. So, Paul, would you pray
All
for
right,
us?
let's pray. Dear God, we pause on this Sabbath morning, and can't help but in the quietness with the pause, we think about recent events in our world, in our nation, in our community here, and really it's difficult to know how to begin to pray even. Within our Sabbath school class, we know of specific needs that have been shared in the past, and certainly since our last meeting there would be additional needs that if we were meeting together we would hear about. Lord, I would ask that in each of these situations we would be able to sense your presence somehow, and that, as is the case in the chapter that we'll look at today, that you would touch us and that you would strengthen us, that you would encourage us. And Lord, I pray that you would work in our community, in our Sabbath school class, to bring comfort and healing and restoration in whatever way it's needed, for the requests that we weren't even able to hear about this morning. So I pray for protection as well. I ask God that the coronavirus, that we hear sort of differing predictions as to how dire it may be, or some who say that maybe it really won't be quite as bad. Lord, we would ask for surprisingly good news as the days and the weeks come. But come what may we find our peace and our strength in you.
Yes.
And I thank you that we have confidence that in the end, ultimately in the end, your will be done, good will triumph, and there will be a day of full and complete restoration. So we claim that promise today, and I ask that you be with us, the four of us, as we sit here and talk together this morning, that you guide our discussion, may it be of value somehow. And I ask all these things in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Let's go ahead and transition into our Sabbath school lesson. And our lead teacher today is Dr. Jody Washburn, Daniel chapter 10. So Jody, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to start by pointing out something that Jacques Ducan notes in his book, in the chapter devoted to Daniel 10. And it is that the progression that we see in this chapter is not only seen here, it's also seen in the previous chapter that we just looked at last week, Daniel 9. And it's some sort of a three-part progression that he describes as beginning with a despair, deep despair over prophecy that does not seem to be being fulfilled, like some sort of gap between what's expected and what Daniel is experiencing. And then the second part is Daniel actually not just talking about his grief, but acting out his grief. Gesture of contrition, being prostrate on the ground, right? Like just overcome with grief. And then in both cases, the third part is this heavenly being appearing, bringing this incredible sense of consolation and hope and courage, even though the situation per se is not resolved in the way expected, or maybe not at all. And so this three-part sort of structure we see in both of these chapters, and I just find it really helpful, even in the situation that we find ourselves in, to think about that, you know, God being active, even when it's not the way we expect or how we might hope, but this knowing that God is active. And I actually want to start with a poem before we go into looking at this chapter specifically. I ran into a student a couple of days ago who, in contrast to the many who are panicking about logistics, said this was a gift, this time, that they needed this time to slow down, to resolve some things with family and friends at home. And I also ran across a poem that someone wrote this week, just 2 or 3 days ago, and I thought I would read it because it ties into both what we value in our Seventh-day Adventist community and also just a way to look for the next action in today's situation. So it's called Pandemic. It says, "What if you thought of it as the Jews consider the Sabbath, the most sacred of times? Cease from travel, cease from buying and selling. Give up just for now on trying to make the world different than it is. Sing, pray, touch only those to whom you commit your life. Center down. And when your body has become still, reach out with your heart. Know that we are connected in ways that are terrifying and beautiful. Know that our lives are in one another's hands. Do not reach out your hands, reach out your heart, reach out your words, reach out all the tendrils of compassion that move invisibly where we cannot touch. Promise this world your love, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, so long as we all shall live." Lynn Ungar, Wednesday of this week, wrote that poem. And I think it ties in not only to the juxtaposition of crisis and also this space and time as a gift, and also the tensions that we see in this chapter. So I would like to start out, this is a rich chapter. So I would like to start out after noting, that God is active on a cosmic level, even when we struggle to see how his will is being acted out. Noting the chapter involves prayer and God's response to prayer. I would like to open and just ask what stands out to you as the something beautiful or something noteworthy in this chapter. What can we take away from this chapter 10 that for us today?
I thought it was interesting, just the 3-week time span. So for me, of course, it connects with our own time span that starts, and we're talking about, no class with spring break, students off campus, and then 4 weeks of no face-to-face classes, and thinking already how our community is kind of struggling with that, because it's this issue of relationships. How do we worship together on Sabbath when we really can't come together? So that made me just kind of think of Daniel and this turmoil and the challenge we already face, and we're not even we're 2 days in.
Yeah. We already feel it. I mean, he's mourning for these 3 weeks, and something interesting here is that this is set in the time of year that would have been the Passover, and yet he's specifically described as not eating or drinking, and this is virtually unheard of. There are a few examples. For instance, in Esther we see an example where you would expect this feast, like the eating of the Passover lamb and drinking of the wine, right? But they abstain, right? But in most cases, this would be unheard of, to abstain from Passover, because it's a symbol of everything God has done, the deliverance, that God is our salvation. And so there's an added note to this too, that it's not just saying Daniel is responding to this great sense that something is not working out like it should, right? And entreating God to act on his behalf, but there's an extra emphasis because of that Passover.
It's an interesting connection because Passover is not that far away right now. And
No.
I think as I looked at Israel and their decision to close their borders, I know there's a push from the religious community because
to protect those
Passover's
celebrations,
coming,
yeah.
and they're going to want to celebrate, and you're not going to stop them.
Very
so
important.
it's a lot of tension. So
It is the first month in the third year of King Cyrus.
Mm-hmm.
King Cyrus has just released that edict, that decree for the people to leave, to go back home.
Mm-hmm.
So this might well speak to that time where Daniel's people are getting ready to leave Babylon and go back home to a ruined city in Jerusalem, a ruined temple, and Daniel's mind is all with them.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. Some people read this and look at the framing dates that are provided, and they note the fact that Daniel in chapter 9 was praying for just that,
Yes.
right? So in a way, the edict of Cyrus, that people could return and build their temples and return to their home communities, is an answer to that prayer, beautiful prayer of petition and confession in Daniel 9. And yet Daniel 9 concludes with this far-off promise of a Messiah figure. So there's also that, like, will this be the moment that the Messiah comes? And now many people see this great grief that Daniel is feeling physically, right? To be a response to learning that the return of the refugees back was not the glorious fulfillment that was expected. You know, that in Ezra you read
his
about
expectations were much.
Yes, you hear this and you think, it's fulfilled, and then you get a letter back and realize, ooh, this is not how we expected it to go. So much opposition, sickness, there's all sorts of issues in that community, and it is not as simple as.
Isn't that a challenge too for us on a personal level, because we have expectations of what the spiritual life or spiritual journey is supposed to be, right? So expectations of a marriage, expectations of our children, and we often have, I like to call it a children's story theology. Which,
if you do this,
if you
then
pray,
this will happen.
Angel comes, oh, everything's wonderful, and you're like, wait, but I didn't get better from my illness. The diagnosis was bad. How does that? Where's God in that process? And that, I think, is what Daniel's going through, perhaps.
Yeah.
To me, it's really interesting that this is the only place in the book of Daniel, in verse 1, chapter 10, verse 1, where he says that Daniel had an understanding of the vision. He did not understand at the end of chapter 7. Throughout chapter 7, he was really concerned what is going on there with all those terrible beasts. He, at the end of chapter 8, he was really sick and had to continue to work throughout that. And then he prayed in chapter 9, and at the end of chapter 9, Gabriel comes back and gives him that vision of that coming Messiah. And this Messiah is going to put an end to all the sin and iniquity that Daniel had asked to be forgiven in his prayer. And this chapter 9 ends with that interpretation of Gabriel. And then in chapter 9, verse 1, he tells us that he understood it.
Interesting.
He understood that vision of the Messiah that came after the prayer in chapter 9. And now in chapter 10, this vision, this appearance of the Messiah is coming to him. So it's not just Gabriel coming to explain. Now the Messiah himself appears, and he is described in the way he is clothed and so on, and that takes us through.
And you have those there, the explicit
Yes.
textual parallels with Ezekiel,
Yeah.
right? Where you see one in the likeness of the glory of the, right? There's all these distancing phrases, and then you have all the chrysolite, the way they're dressed, the eyes, all of this, and it comes again then in not only Ezekiel 1, but also in Revelation.
Right, with
Yes.
chapter 1 of Revelation.
Yep, same,
Christ is
same.
dressed like a high priest and
Yes.
so forth.
So
Now,
here,
isn't there
yes.
something too, you can maybe help us with this, something in the Hebrew that kind of identifies the connection with the prince, that, because you talked about word aspects, that what is there word-wise that might show us that this is not just a regular being, but maybe something more significant?
I think the phrase usually used is one like a son of man, which in both Aramaic and Hebrew doesn't mean a child. So bar or ben, it can mean child, but it means, especially in Aramaic, but I think also in Hebrew it can be used this way, it's a category. So when it says like one like, and you have the same thing, like one like a son of God. And so it's trying to say, like, this belongs to this category. And you see that in Joshua 5:13, as well as
Joshua 5:13, that's the commander of the Lord's
Yeah,
army. It's
yep.
usually translated as commander, but
Yep.
it's the same word for as
I would have to
translated
look
prince
that
here.
up.
It is.
It is,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, it is
Yeah,
the same.
so these little phrases are tying these figures that appear as deliverance figures.
So kind of
all
unique
the way
terminology,
through.
right? So in Joshua it's there,
Yep.
Joshua,
and then now
you
it's
have
here,
it,
and then
and then you have the Ezekiel's vision, and even in, and this is not now, this is not the vision up in verses 5 through 6 that I'm talking about now, but Dukan points out later when the angel reaches out and touches Daniel, and then says, you who are greatly beloved or
Yeah.
highly
Verse 18.
esteemed,
Yeah.
consider carefully what I am about to speak to you, and he ties that in with Gabriel appearing to Mary in the opening part of Luke, and that message of do not be afraid, right? Do not be afraid. God is active. So I think there are little allusions throughout this chapter that are picked up with other texts, and this chapter itself picks up other texts, tying together this appearance of God and action of God on behalf of his people.
I loved and this is maybe diverting, we can come back if we need to, but I loved the lesson pointed this out, but the 3 touches, the first one enabling him to stand.
To stand, yep.
The second one enabling him to speak, and then the third touch giving him strength.
Beautiful.
And to me, maybe the favorite passage is in verse 19. The don't be afraid. You referenced it already. Peace, be strong now. Be strong. And I was thinking this morning when I got the early morning call that we would be gathered here, and I read through this. I thought really there's a connection. This peace and then be strong. Those aren't, in a sense, those are not really two separate things. I think that when we have peace, it's like it's from a place of like personal peace that then we're able to behave in appropriate ways. And again, I couldn't help but think about the situation that we're in now, and the more terrified I am and anxious and fearful, then I'm unable to behave in ways that are beneficial or strong for others. But when I'm at peace, then there's a sense in which that is a kind of strength then that it enables me to impact others around me as well.
This is, you mentioned the three touches,
3 touches.
and you realize also, not in the exact same places, but actually when I mentioned, you who are highly esteemed, I was looking at verse
a different
11.
spot.
Yeah, 11
And then
19.
you end up with also multiple, so you have multiple touches, right? But you also have multiples of that phrase, do not be afraid.
Yes.
Do not be afraid. Verse 12, you see it again down in where you read it in 19.
I like also the multiple phrases, right? Because this is like the Bible's way of emphasizing something. The greatly loved.
Yes.
Because it's so easy for us, to not have that same vision of ourselves, and just this affirmation that God has for Daniel. And I think he speaks those words to us too. They're powerful.
I do find it interesting to tie the 3 chapters like you already did with chapter 8, 9, and 10 to see them, see the same vision of an appearance. There are 2 words that the book of Daniel uses and they are often translated as vision, and sometimes there is the word appearance added. The one word that is used always for the beasts, for the animals that come in the vision.
Is that the feminine or
That's the chazon.
Oh, okay.
Vision. The other word is used every time when there is an appearance of somebody who looks like a human being. And it is in chapter 8. It's it transitions into chapter 9 because of Gabriel, who comes to explain chapter 8. And then that vision of the human being who appears is prominent in our chapter now.
Repeatedly mentioned, yep.
But it is already in chapter 8 where that appearance of a man in verse 15 came to Daniel. And in that case, this man is a strong being, like a warrior. But this warrior, a divine warrior, is watching the beasts, the ram and the goat fighting. But he is not intervening there. He is not getting in between those fights. But he is doing something that he is doing constantly now in chapter 10. He's touching him.
Interesting.
In chapter 8 already. He's touching him and tells him, get up and I tell you everything. At the end, when Daniel hears the interpretation, he is so sick that he does not know what to make, not of the beasts, but of this appearance of a man, of a divine warrior, who seems to
not do anything.
not do anything about
not
the battle.
intervene. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But now,
He intervenes now.
when Gabriel comes, he tells him this appearance of a man is the Messiah, the Prince,
Yeah.
in verse 25.
Yep.
9 verse 25.
And
Yeah,
then you
chapter
get to
9.
chapter
Yes.
10 where it says, I have, the understanding of the message or the word was given to him in a mar'eh, in the vision,
Yes.
right? And then
It's not
It-
in the
he
vision, it's
immediately-
the mare.
he immediately mourns. So
Yeah.
he's still struck, or he doesn't know
Yes.
what to do with the presence of this being.
So now this being comes to him not anymore like a strong warrior, but now he comes to him like
gentle.
a priest, in the clothes of a priest.
With the sash and the
Yes.
robe and everything. Yeah.
And
That's
now
right.
he is touching him.
Like
And
that.
if we understand a little bit about the sanctuary and the role of the priest and the work of priests in the sanctuary, that had to do a lot with relations to the body, and all those parts that in the book of Leviticus are told, you cannot go into the sanctuary if your body is
Right.
unclean. And Daniel is here falling to the ground, and nobody else realizes that. All those people that are with him do not. So he's by himself, and this priestly appearance, who is actually told to be like a man. He is a human, he's a man. And then he touches him. And again, that gives so much
Comfort.
a comfort.
Strength.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that relation work between the high priest, who is taking care of
His
this
people.
old man who has lived his life in Babylon and now does not know what is going to happen to his people. And he will tell him, have peace, be strong, because this is about your people, right?
That's beautiful.
That is what
And
I
the
see the
and the
story.
response is not
Yes.
only here, right? Even
Yes.
Ezekiel, when he has the vision that we think of as very removed, like it's so complicated you can't put it into language, right? But Ezekiel also falls to his face,
Yes.
right? So this response is seen throughout when the presence becomes so
John the
unmistakable.
Revelator falls
Yep,
also.
fall. So
Yeah.
so this falling to the ground
Yep.
in the presence of this being that seems like a man but is much more,
Yes.
That's beautiful.
In one of my classes with my students, we worked through chapter 10, and I had them do the ones who are taking their majors in psychology and these areas. I had them read through chapter 10 and like specifically point us to those places where you see this emotional expression in this story here. Daniel, who does not understand, who becomes dumbfounded and then is touched, and all of those aspects. There is so much
being
emotion
pale
in there.
and
Yes.
We kind of touched on this, but he is old, isn't he?
Yes.
I mean, I've heard like around 90 or something. I'm not good with all the chronology
I
and history,
also
but
ran
it's very, very
across
old.
an
Yes.
estimate like that, yeah.
Even.
Yes.
Not that 90 is old.
Younger all the time. It's
But,
younger all the
you know,
time.
yeah.
Younger all the time.
We
But
wish we would
he
get there.
he is not able to go. This is part of why we say he was not able to go back.
Yes.
If
Because
he had
of his
chosen,
age.
because it
Because
would
of
not
his
maturity.
It made it more difficult for him. to
I'm
travel.
curious what I actually have not looked into this, but do any of you know the significance of, other than the parallels with Revelation, do you know the significance of the eyes like blazing fire or flaming torches? Does that have any other significance besides painting this high priestly figure?
I don't know, but the Persian Empire is Zoroastrian, at least to some degree, and for them, fire and flame is sacred. It's one of the 4 sacred elements, and when they worship, when they pray, they will always orient themselves towards light, and usually that's fire. And so I
So
don't
some
know
sort
if
of
there's
Interesting. Could be
admitting this one is
more.
divine.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, this
Yeah.
is
Well,
and
Don't you have Genesis 15 where the torches
have
of
the flame
fire
of fire,
pass?
Between the
yes.
pieces.
Yep.
And
Yes.
that's symbolizing
Yes.
God,
Yep.
embodying the
covenant.
covenant.
The
The
covenant
covenant with-
making.
Yeah,
Yes.
with Abram.
And we could go on. I mean, there are
Mhm.
plenty of examples.
I would
with-
also go to Isaiah chapter 6, where you
Yeah.
have King Uzziah, who was a leper and died, and then there is this vision of God sitting on his throne, and he is described in that majestic way, and then Isaiah feels that he is unworthy
Woe
and
is me.
unclean.
Yep.
And the text makes this beautiful structure, chiasm there, that the lips are unclean, and he will be restored.
Cleansed.
But then he is given the task to go to the people and speak to them, and eyes that are don't want to see will become seeing eyes. Ears that are not
closed to
hearing,
hearing.
yes.
Yep.
The heart that is heavy and is going to be willing to be opened to God's word.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
You know, we mentioned a couple things before we started recording, and I know our time is quickly coming to a close, but we mentioned, I think, we could talk about it if you're okay, but like the great controversy element here, cosmic battle maybe, and then we also talked about prayer. I'm just curious if any thoughts?
Who's the prince of Persia that delayed the answer? Old Testament people, I'm looking at you. And my study Bible has it right here.
Okay.
It describes it as a demonic personality, an angel that is in some sense responsible maybe or over the region of Persia. I know that in missions there are groups of people who engage, they think of it as spiritual warfare in prayer, asking that the demonic powers over specific regions of the world, that those powers be broken or limited, or that people
Restrained.
be freed, that they see whole groups of people or whole regions, whole nations kind of under, I mean all of us to some degree, but that they're sort of under the control of the influence of a demonic power. So I don't know how Old Testament scholars might relate
I
to
think
something
chapter
like that.
11 will take us to that more in a lot of details,
Yeah.
right? But So if we are in Cyrus' third year, there is still time going on where the Israelites are going to be, the Jews are going to go back and start rebuilding. But they will be stopped. And the ones who have their problems with them and stopping them will send letters to
Yes.
the Persian,
Right.
the
Yes.
Persian authorities and the Persian king,
Yeah.
and the building will be stopped. And then we'll finally go on again when Haggai and so on, the prophets come to like encourage them to continue to build it. So there is this background battle happening that is visible in the prophetic literature of Haggai and a few others, and then also Nehemiah and Ezra, Nehemiah, the books that we had before, where we saw them. They had to put to make sure that they can continue to build, and it stopped for a while. Then they went on with that. So is it possible to put that background story at the end of this?
I think so.
It's like you know, the story behind the scenes, the real story, and
Yes.
makes you wonder about our political powers and how that plays out in that kind of image. We often don't think that way, but here in this case, Michael comes to help Gabriel
Yeah.
in that contending for God's people.
If I could actually, I say actually because I think sometimes we say we believe something, but in our daily lives we sort of demonstrate that we don't really believe that it's the case. But if I really believed that there's this spiritual battle going on, and that my prayers really like made a difference when I prayed, that there were like angelic beings that would like join in the fray, so to speak. It seems to me like I would be quicker to pray, and I would probably pray more faithfully if I really believed that that was the case. I find that even though I would say otherwise, I think I behave lots of times as if prayer is kind of just a sort of self-talk. It helps me to process and kind of open up to God, and that's sort of the benefit of prayer. And I don't believe that, and yet I tend to live as though that's the way it is. So.
And how many? Go ahead.
I just wish I was more. I wish I was more faithful in prayer, and by faithful, I guess meaning it both like in consistency and then full of faith in my prayer. Faithful in that sense too. So sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I can't help but think of two things. I mean, having just finished a quarter where I was teaching wisdom literature with one group, and then overview of Christian beliefs with another group, and talking about prayer. You know, students often, it doesn't take very many experiences to kind of dampen one's perception of prayer. So and we see this, we are not alone. Daniel is the same way. Like he's not having his prayer answered the way he expects, and he greatly grieves and mourns, and yet we see him returning to full pleading with God on behalf of his people. And I would say the range of experience is fascinating. Like students who read someone else's experience. Like we did a practice of 15 minutes of silence, and then they reflected on what it was like to just slow down, have some stillness. And a few students out of 45 wrote on the online discussion that they had sensed God telling them something. Then of course the other 42, right? Not all of them, but a few representative voices who were willing to articulate their feelings said, well, I didn't hear God speaking to me, so what does that mean, right? And the same with Job, like thinking of other figures in this controversy. We want to blame God for everything and then say, well, forget it because he's not doing anything to stop injustice. And yet there are other figures at work, like we have here the Prince of Persia, and yet I can't help but going back to verse 12. I mean, since the first day that you devoted your mind to gain understanding and you humbled yourself, right, before your God, your words were heard.
Yes.
And if we can just focus on that, like God is active, even when we look at our circumstances and we don't see what we wish to see.
Yeah, and that's, I think, in many human relationships, even, that is our greatest hope, actually. We don't expect someone else to fix all the problems,
be
but
heard.
to be
We
ignored.
want to be heard. We want to be
ignored,
seen,
or
yeah.
to be like as if we don't matter, and isn't. That's sort of the ultimate agony. But if we know that we are really heard, that itself is extremely.
I think that's probably a good place to draw this to a close. In doing that, I thought of a pre-conversation we had with Dr. Fry, and down in verse 20, when this being who comes to Daniel, he says, "Do you know why I've come to you?" And in our conversation, I mentioned that this was a question that really wasn't answered. There was no answer. And Dr. Fry said, "No, there is an answer." And that's the previous verse, when it says that, he says, "I was strengthened and said, 'Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me.'" And so the answer is, why did he come? Because Daniel needed strengthening. And what a beautiful picture of God. And I think of us and the challenges we're facing, challenges we will face in the weeks to come, that our God hears and our God strengthens. And may you, for whatever your circumstance is, where you find yourself isolated at home, worried or concerned about your parents or about yourself and your well-being, that you'll know that God hears your prayers and God will also strengthen you. So thank you for joining us. Thank you again for Dr. Dibdahl, Dr. Fry, and Dr. Washburn for the last second coming and join us this morning. And we hope to see you next week, probably not in person still, but in our virtual community. So take care and God bless. Bye-bye.